Hello, my name is Christian, and welcome back to Therapy Talks, our format where we let people in behind the curtain and kind of explain a little bit what we do as therapists and therapy. Today, I had the chance to chat with our therapist, Joe Stevens. Joe is a licensed professional counselor, mental health service provider. I think that's his full license. And he and I had a chance to chat about his experience as a therapist, what he's been up to, and then we spend an hour or so talking about myths around therapy, what actually happens in therapy, how we conceptualize therapy, um, and a couple of hints and tips for people that might be new to therapy and might be trying it out for the first time. At times, it was a really nerdy and heady conversation that I really enjoyed. I think there are some helpful things in there for folks that have just started therapy or for people that are interested in learning more about therapy and what it might be like to meet with a therapist. So, if this is you and if you're interested in a nerdy conversation about therapy and learning more about the process of what it is that we actually do when the door is closed, I invite you to keep watching because here's Joe Stevens. Welcome, Joe.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, so glad that we're doing this morning. You were, when we started therapy was me, myself, and I.
Yeah.
Shortly thereafter, you were the first one to join the team.
Yeah. I think it was April 2022, 2021 or something. It was a long time ago at this point.
Yes.
I was the first person that you hired. And then I remember that you were having a trip out of the country at one point. So it was a real moment of trust in a way that was
Yeah.
kind of strange. You took this baby that you had been incubating for a long time and then handed it to a stranger and then
Little
left the
keys.
country. And I was like, dang, okay. This dude trusts me. I'll take it.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I guess I'm curious for the people that don't already know and love you like we
Right.
do. Um, can you give us a little bit of an introduction as to who you are and what you've been up to?
Yeah. So my name is Joe. I'm a licensed professional counselor and mental health service provider. That's what those letters stand for. The work that I do here is primarily to administer talk therapy to private pay clients. Talk therapy itself is a very weird and strange process, whatever that is. And I'm sure we'll talk about what that is. Um, but yeah, mostly I do talk therapy, in person, telehealth. We do meetings once a week. And other than that, I'm just sort of here to help support other people.
And you meet with both individuals and couples.
Yes, individuals, couples, people of all ages, ranges, relationship types, all kinds of stuff.
Got it. What did you do before joining therapy?
Well, before joining therapy, I was working as a therapist at another place. I kind of came up in therapy, the profession. So I went straight through from high school to undergraduate to grad school, and then straight into my professional career. So therapy is really all I've ever done. But I've worked in a number of different settings around that. So I prior to this job, I was working at another private practice place. Prior to that, I was working at a local sort of community organization, doing some really important work. Um, yeah. So I've been around a couple of different mental health spaces. I've learned from a lot of different types of clinicians and a lot of different types of settings. So
Awesome. When it comes to your education and training, I feel like there's like a few, well, really, there's a lot of people, both in like our immediate circles and like mentors that we look up to, and then also like the stars of the therapy world, if you will,
yeah,
that are all, all the books that we read and the trainings that we take. Who do you feel like has influenced your approach the most?
that's a good question. I think I've gotten influences from a lot of different places. One of the places where I feel like I've gotten a lot of influence is actually a dude who fired me from a previous job. I don't know if that should be in the interview, but we'll have to see. Um, yeah, I got a real crash course in psychodynamic therapy
Mm.
for 3 straight months at an old job, and that really stripped me down to fundamentals, and then tried to build back up sort of any kind of clinical technique or clinical talent. So that was actually a big influence on the work. But what I found there was that a lot of it was around client counselor relationship, around the
Mm.
sort of how do you put yourself into the room? How do you talk about yourself? How do you show up for your clients? And so from there, it's been several years now of working very hard on sort of how I understand therapy to work.
Mhm.
Um, these days, that's influenced a lot by there's this like YouTube series called Talking Therapy, where each video gets like 2 or 3 thousand views. But it's just these two really old clinicians who just sit around and talk about what therapy is. And that was a really big influence on me as well. I would have to say, clinically, though, my primary sort of source of clinical information was all the sort of like narrative and existential therapies that sort of bloomed out of Rogerian therapy.
Mm.
So if I have to trace it back to like a lineage, what does my style come from? I would say it probably comes from like Rogers and Rogerian, like humanistic, relationship focused, like that kind of stuff.
Got it. And that's probably going to influence how are you going to show up in the therapy room and how are you conceptualize. So what what therapy is for you. Because we're kind of
Absolutely.
like almost we're getting to talking about, okay, what actually is therapy, which is one of the reasons we're doing this series of just people that are new to therapy or trying it out for the first time.
Mhm.
Feel like they have a little bit of understanding of what happens when the
Yeah.
door is closed and when you're sitting down with a therapist.
Well, that's probably the biggest question that I get in any of the consults that I do is
Mm.
like outside of like how much does this cost? It'll be like, hey, what is therapy and how do we do it? Like, what are you doing here? Do I just show up and I just talk and cry and then I'm fixed or whatever?
Yeah. So let's talk about the consultations because that's usually the first touch point.
Yeah.
If if the client has never done therapy before, they're going to find us. However, they find us, they're going to talk to Emmeline,
Mm,
and Emmeline is going to match them with a person that she thinks might be a good fit for them, and they'll sit down with one of us for a 15-minute free consultation.
yep.
Um, and I would say, I'm not sure about your case though, but I would probably say about 50-50 of I've done this before and this is my first rodeo in therapy.
Yeah, that's pretty common. I get a lot of people. It's rare that you get anybody who's been like, oh, I've been like once or twice. Usually it's like, oh, I've never done this before. Or, oh, I've been in therapy for like 10 years.
Yeah.
And this is just another leg of it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So I think this is a really useful question to answer.
What are some of the common myths or misconceptions that you've encountered over the time as being a therapist, either in consultations or in your work with clients or elsewhere?
Yeah. I think there's a couple that I really run into sometimes. I think the one that's like, that was personally the hardest for me to figure out how to deal with was the idea that sometimes clients come and think that therapists have the answers for everything. Of
Mm,
like, oh, you're the person who's supposed to tell me how to live, right?
mhm,
And the amount of time I spend in therapy where I'm just like, no, I'm actually not allowed to tell you what to do. It's my job to be non-judgmental, stuff like that. So that's one of the major misconceptions that I see. Uh, but I would say one of the ones that I probably deal with in those like consultation calls the most are often a lot of the like stigmatizing myths around
mhm,
therapy. Like, oh, if you're going to therapy, that means there's something wrong or broken with you. A couple that comes to therapy, their relationship's just doomed to fail. That's where like failing relationships go. Or the idea, weirdly enough, that I think a lot of people carry in our current society of like, well, I should be able to do all of this by myself.
mhm.
I should be able to just like figure out what's wrong with me. I'm looking at the world and like other people make it work, and I don't seem to be making it work. I just touched the mic, and I don't seem to be making it work. But the trouble with that is that people will see that and assume that there's something like wrong or broken with them.
Mhm.
Well, I'm not succeeding because I'm lazy. I'm not succeeding because I'm traumatized. I'm not succeeding because of this, that, or the other. Those I would argue are sort of the two main lanes for misconceptions of like misunderstanding what therapy is and how it works, and then misunderstanding sort of what it means to be in therapy
Yeah,
as a personal identity.
right. Totally.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if this ever happened to you. I think early on in my career,
Yeah.
when I was closer to being out of grad school, when I maybe looked a little bit younger and had less gray hair, I think it was kind of what you're talking about. People were like, well, you are however old I was,
Right.
25, 26. Um, what is it that you can tell me as a 60-year-old about my life or what I should do next? You don't have kids. Like
Yeah,
you
exactly.
don't know how to navigate that. And it kind of comes from the assumption that a good therapist is essentially somebody that has lived a long, healthy life.
And it's like made all the mistakes and learned just
Right.
by ramming their head into the brick wall over and over.
That's right. And then telling the client, well, here is how you need to navigate it.
Here's how I figured it out. You'll
That's
figure it
right.
out this way too.
Right.
I actually feel a little bit grateful for the way that my professional trajectory lined up. because this is a question I've been sort of struggling with since I started doing therapy because I haven't really done any other work outside of
Mhm.
this. This was a question I used to ask a lot of my like grad school professors and stuff of like, hey, so if you don't have that experience, what do you do? And this was a misconception that I've heard sort of rebutted a lot.
Mhm.
Um, yeah,
What's
a lot of,
your Go ahead.
yeah. Well, I was just going to say a lot of sort of how I approach that is I try to be very open and honest about that. I'm very clear with my clients. And if you've worked with me before, are intending to work with me, you'll probably hear me say something along the lines of, well, I don't know how to handle this. This is the first time I've encountered something like this, or I don't know what would work here. I think those are some of the more powerful statements that I make in therapy because again, like there's so much about therapy that's about the relationship that's developing between client and counselor. So if I'm sitting here acting like I have solutions when I don't, uh, that would fundamentally be like dishonest or disingenuous. And
Mhm.
that's not sort of what I'm here to do.
To me, it always goes back to I think about therapy as like the meeting of two experts.
I've heard this before. Yes.
And the idea of the client comes in with being an expert on their lived experience,
Hmm.
the things that they have tried that haven't worked for whatever reason, be it in their relationships at work or in their romantic life, or just kind of their relationship with themselves when it comes to anxiety, depression, stress, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Um, they have lived experiences, they have their own sets of values and their own goals of where they want to go in life. And they might be very different than mine.
Hmm.
Um, but it's not about them finding a carbon copy of themselves 10 years in the future. So it's just like, yeah, that's what it sometimes feels like. I'm looking for, or clients are looking for therapists that are a carbon copy of them just 20 years ahead. So they can
Yeah.
essentially tell them, like, oh, you need to turn right here and then left over here. It's like, that's not quite how that works. It's really,
Mhm.
I think for me, I'm not sure if you've heard about this analogy before, like the idea of all of us climbing our own mountain.
Yeah.
And when a therapist, just like a client, has their own mountain to climb in life. And
For
it's
damn sure.
not
Yeah.
a matter of me as a therapist abandoning my own life journey, jumping over to the client and pushing them up, or having climbed their mountain and pulling them up. It's really about me sitting over here watching you climb your mountain. There's a certain perspective that
And then
I
yelling
have.
pointers from the armchair, right?
There's a certain perspective I have that you don't. And so there's power in that, but you're still the one that's doing the thing. And it's not to say that I've figured everything out.
Yeah. And that's God, my brain's going like six different directions. Uh that's one of the things that I'm really grateful for you introducing to me, or I guess introducing to the office here, the concept of process-based therapy, because that's something that I think clicks right into this concept
Mm,
is uh so the idea behind process-based therapy is that there's a lot of different ways that therapy can work. And there's a lot of different people who have written all kinds of books about this is how therapy is supposed to work.
right.
This is what it's supposed to look like. But ultimately, the profession's only like 100 years old,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Baby.
it's baby. We're all still trying to figure it out. And the idea behind process-based therapy is it tried to look at all these different styles and say, okay, what are the commonalities between all of them? And what's the sort of like generalized approach that we can understand from here? Um, and I think that goes right along with what you're saying. I will not know the perspective from which you will need to view your own life to trust yourself to move forward again. Like I will not know like how exactly to word the right sentence that all of a sudden you're fixed or whatever. But as a person, it's my job, or as a therapist, it's my job to understand as many of those perspectives as possible and be as understanding to new perspectives when they come in. I think that's one of the difficult parts.
Yeah. And it's almost like you would never go to a cardiologist and ask them about their heart surgery or heart health.
Yeah, right.
Have you dealt with this as I'm like looking to get my heart taken care of? Um, Even addiction work. Like there are peer counselors. Like there is value in, hey, I have a lived experience of what I know what it's like being trapped by substances.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean that a person that's never been trapped by substances, they may not have that lived experience. Again, they're not the expert on that experience. But what we as therapists bring to the table is being the expert in creating change.
Mhm.
Like we know if you're saying you're over here and you're telling me you want to go over here, charting that path science has some things to say about that. And we have some thoughts about here's how you can start making that happen.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to do that for you. You have to do it. Um,
That
yeah.
can often be a real like cul-de-sac that some clients find themselves in is if they're looking for, but not clear that they're looking for somebody else to sort of make the decisions for them. And if I'm looking for, but not really clear about the fact that that's not how this works here, we can find ourselves in that cul-de-sac pretty regularly,
Mhm.
unfortunately. I have some clients who like, I'll like use that terminology with them at this point. I'm like, oh, we're in the cul-de-sac again.
Mhm.
All right. How do we actually break out of
Mhm.
this?
It's like somebody right out of med school can do a hip replacement. They don't have to go through their own hip replacement.
Yeah.
And I think the same is true for therapists. Like there are great therapists that are young and early in their career
Mhm. You're
because
looking at one
they
of them.
that's right. Because they have figured out and acquired the skill set, the toolbox that is change making.
Yeah.
That is not you can have a 60-year-old therapist. Um,
Could be bad.
could be bad. And it's an interesting, I'm not sure if we've talked about these studies before, but they've looked at therapists and, there's this like 10,000 hour rule and like
Yeah.
it takes 10,000 hours to master whatever you put your mind to.
Oh, yeah. I think about this all the time.
It's not true for therapy,
No.
which always like blows my mind. Just
It,
because somebody
mhm.
has done this for 50 years, what it predicts is confidence, how confident they feel as a therapist. It does not predict competence and how
Exactly.
fit they
Yeah.
are.
Which is one of the things that I think about all the time. What's the word? Disconnecting my sense of competence from my sense of confidence has been one of the most like powerful tools that I've
Mm,
had as a therapist
mm,
because it really lets me to like sort of cut loose and like mug the camera that I'm incredible or whatever, which I am.
mm,
But also understand that like the actual skill set is something that I'm working on. This is something that I wanted to bring up as well because one of the things that I know about therapy is that it is such a personalized process. You like almost as a therapist have to approach it from whatever perspectives you bring to it. So for instance, I played a lot of like team sports, played a lot of like school sports growing up. So that concept of practice and routine and skill development and confidence development around those skills, those are things that I've like sort of been immersed in for a long time. So that's part of the skill set that I try to bring to learning how to do therapy. Um, yeah, that was actually one of the curiosities that I always have when I meet other therapists is like, well, I wonder what frame of reference they come from. And um, often it messes with, or often it informs the different metaphors you'll use or the different perspectives that you'll use and stuff. So like a lot of my background is like sports or like anime or video games or uh, like certain parts of literature and like very like specific and niche like corners of my own
mm,
personal life that I've been able to find like meaningful or valuable connections to the therapy
mm.
process. Um,
Trying to
yeah,
think what that is for me. I think one person that if somebody does therapy with me, or one person that really influenced my kind of own journey to become a therapist, maybe
yeah,
I guess it's a little bit different, would be my driving instructor
yeah.
in Germany. So in Germany, the driving school, honestly, I'm not really sure how it is here, but in
Mhm.
Germany, you have to go to a driving school. I took about 20 hours of theory classes, like going to a classroom learning,
Whew.
and then about 40 to 50 hours of like actual practical driving with a driving instructor,
Yeah.
including driving on the Autobahn, driving at night,
Well,
driving in
shit.
rainy conditions. And so it's a very regimented process,
Right.
also very expensive compared to here. Um, but it allowed me to sit next to somebody that was kind of asking a lot of like big questions that might lead somebody to go to therapy.
Yeah.
And so I think I was early on kind of introduced to it's like, oh yeah, I'm 17. I'm like trying to figure out how the stop sign works, but these are interesting questions that I'm hearing. So that kind of got me interested and hooked. But
So he would just like drive you, or y'all would just like be driving around, and he just ask you, "So what is the meaning of life, and what do you think is of
yeah, it was a she.
she?" My
And
apologies.
uh-huh. And it was really that was part of it. And
Yeah,
also just kind of reflecting on what she was doing. Like she wasn't really super happy being a driving instructor,
that's an
talking
interesting
about
conversation.
yeah. So she's I mean, she was happy enough that she liked hanging out with me and doing this thing, but there was
Hmm.
definitely a like, I'm not sure if I want to be doing this in 10 years time.
I know
And
what you
so
mean.
kind of thinking about those things. Um, But yeah, things that influence me, I think the fact that English is my second language,
I think about that all the time whenever I work with you.
it gives a unique perspective because everything is a little bit less black and white.
Yeah,
There's like a little bit more context. Um, it's definitely a big thing. I'm a big movie nerd, and so I will talk
absolutely.
about The Matrix. I will talk about Inception is one of my favorite movies.
Mhm.
So they'll really kind of come up in the therapy room. Um,
Yeah,
those sort of things.
I know what you mean. Hearing you talk about the language piece, that is something that I've always felt, I guess in some ways like jealous of or something of like, man, it would be so I think it would be much harder, but I think certain parts of the job would be easier if I had that perspective of like having had to learn the context
Mhm.
behind all of the words instead of just like understanding like what certain ways that people speak mean or like how different accents are used to sort of translate different parts of a person's personality. Um, that would be really interesting to learn from more of an academic
Yeah.
standpoint than a sort of experiential one.
Well, I think even with like ACT,
Yeah,
acceptance and commitment therapy, talking about the idea that it's like language, that the fact that we speak gets us into trouble in the first place.
exactly. Yeah.
And if we only speak one language, it's a very like closely knit relationship that we have of our lived experience in our language. But if
Mhm.
we have two languages, then there's more of a felt sense of like, yeah, this is one way that you can see what's
Yeah.
happening. And I'm also aware that I'm like currently actively
Mhm.
making up stories around what's happening.
That's so much of therapy as well, is like understanding the narrative and the narrative work that goes into it. That's actually something that I understand to be like very important in the concept of fit, like the sort of what we're doing as therapists, how we're developing the relationship. I feel like I know I'm starting to get somewhere with the relationship when I feel like I can plug into that person's sort of lexicon of language to lived
Mhm,
experiences,
mhm,
and when I can start to plug them into mine as
mhm,
well.
mhm.
And so that's why I think almost the more like niche or specific that you pull your references from, the better you can sort of gauge how that person's interacting, or the more likely you are to hit something that's a little bit deeper for them.
Mhm.
Um, because yeah, I'd like to talk about this shit. So that's
No, it's that is true for me too. And so there's almost like, yeah, I have like my way of thinking about things, but I always listen for the client. And so
yeah.
there's a lot of corporate America speak that I now have. I don't work in corporate America, but a lot of my clients do.
Can
Um,
I give you some feedback about that?
go for it.
I hear that sometimes in the way that we talk, like there won't be clients in the room and you'll be talking about like an intervention that you want to do. And you'll talk about like, I don't think you've ever actually said a key performance indicator. Have used some terminology that's gotten
Uh-huh.
close that I've been
Uh-huh.
like, oh, I see where that's coming from.
Yes. And I think that's really me like getting into or getting curious about the client's world
Yeah.
and trying to come up with analogies and metaphors. Like it's just like when, you look at an Excel sheet,
Mhm.
like you would never take an Excel sheet of data that you're analyzing and just delete a couple of rows. But when clients, some clients, the relationship that they have with their emotions, is essentially like emotions don't matter. They're unimportant. In fact, I don't want to have them positive. Well, I want to have positive. I don't want to have negative emotions.
Right.
They do the equivalent of like select all delete.
Yeah.
Like you cannot make sense of the world if you don't have a full data set. And
Exactly.
ultimately
Yeah.
emotions.
And something that
That's
I
what
run
they said.
into, something that I ran into with that is that when those people try to shut off their own emotional experiences, it just leads to them bottling up those emotional experiences and then they ferment into other things.
Yeah.
Um,
They don't go away.
no,
You
no,
can select all delete.
no,
No,
unfortunately,
you
as much
can't.
as we would like to.
Yeah, so we both agree that I mean it's a big myth around. It's like, woo. I mean, it's a big myth that you have to have a older
Mhm.
life experienced therapist that is going to tell you where to turn left and turn right.
Yeah.
It does like what makes therapy work is finding a therapist that knows how to make change and
Mhm.
how to yeah, put things into motion. They don't need to have the same lived experiences as you.
No, and I think that's fair as well. That's something that I think about all the time is how can we widen our experiences? How can we bridge these gaps between people of more and more diverse backgrounds. That's something that I think about a lot in our work.
Yeah. How about the idea? I'm gonna take a drink.
Yeah.
Um, how about the idea of therapy being a quick fix?
Being a quick fix. Well, I've always felt weird about that because obviously there are different styles of therapy, and different styles of therapy have different beliefs on how well or effectively you can practice at different paces. The style of therapy that I've found works best for me is more of the long form stuff, just because that gives me an opportunity to really get to know a client and a client to
Mm,
really get to know me. At the same time, though, I believe the first site that I came up under the way that they practiced there was something called TFCBT, trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy.
mhm,
It's a sort of mix of classic CBT with like a very narrative focused approach to trauma. Um, and that, if I remember correctly, was like a regiment designed for 8 sessions. It was
mm,
like, no, you
mhm,
get in, this is what you do the first session, this is what you do the second session, and you clear it and you're done. Um, the question that I always have around that stuff, there's a lot of like there's a lot of like research backing that can go into those sort of brief interventions. They will often run specific studies of this specific intervention with this specific group and these specific, and look, we get this percentage difference.
mhm.
And so this is the one that works. We know this works. We're going to move forward with this. Uh, Unfortunately, there are so many people and so many situations that fall outside of those. And so it always feels like a bit of open space in the therapy session where I can go, oh, this is lining up with one style that I know, one brief style that I know. I know that we can get a lot of motion if we do this, this, and this over the next three
Mhm.
sessions. And often that will really work. But for the most part, it will take me, it will take us, unfortunately, a while to really figure out what's going on and what's happening there. It will sometimes take 2 or 3 sessions before we even really have a good idea of where we are, where we're going, and how we want to get there.
Mhm. I I agree. And I
Yeah,
think there's also I guess quick fix depends on what it is that they're coming in for, right? And
exactly.
how long has this been going on? If you are like, you can work on so many things in therapy, and different things might have different times.
Yeah,
I mean, it's more common than not when people meet with me for the first time, even after the first session, they feel a sense of like, okay, I'm feeling a little bit better.
absolutely.
And maybe it's just about, I feel like now there's a path forward to either improve my relationship. There's a path forward when it comes to managing my anger. There's a path forward when it comes to living with anxiety and that not having to be my forever state. And so
That's a
there's
big one.
some relief there for sure. Um, but yeah, it also depends if you're trying to work on long-standing
Mhm.
patterns when it comes to your relationships. Over time, you've realized really since, your early relationships, there's always something that has felt off. That is probably not something that we can solve in at one 50-minute session or two 50-minute sessions. Like
Yeah.
that is probably something that we can have conversations about, get curious about, because yeah, it's like, what's currently happening?
Mhm.
Where do you want to go? How do you want to feel? And how can we get you there? Like
Mhm.
those three questions, it takes a little bit of time to kind of unpack that. And, we humans are complex. It's not as easy as just having a 40-minute surgery,
Yeah.
taking out this thing, patching you up, and then you're done.
Yeah. There's no gallbladder removals. There's no
That's right.
appendicitis
Yeah.
in mental health care.
Yeah. It's a little bit more complex with the different variables, like you were talking about the process based therapy of like, okay, what are the processes
Mhm.
that are currently creating, like what has led to the current iteration of you, like this anxiety thing that you might be struggling with, or what's going
Yeah.
on in relationships. It takes a little bit of time to figure out. And yeah, so it's not as easy as here's one session. But for a lot of people at the same time, it's also not 20 or 30 sessions. Like
No. Yeah.
once there's an initial goal, it's like I want to get my anxiety under control. I want to figure out my relationship with anxiety. Like in 8 to 10 sessions, you can see a lot of progress.
Absolutely.
I think what ends up happening for the people that stay
Mhm.
for longer is there's almost a version of like, well, now that that's figured out, I
Yeah.
actually do want to look at my relationships too.
That is one of my favorite points of the therapy process is being like, okay,
Check.
we've been working together for a while and it sounds like the thing you came in to work on isn't there anymore.
Yeah.
What do we do now?
Yeah.
That's probably one of my favorite parts of therapy.
Yeah.
I love graduating clients or moving them on to deeper stuff. Uh, I've been noticing as you were talking though, I had this idea and I was running in my mind over my caseload, and this seems to be true. In my head, when a client comes in and they're very explicit of, oh, this is going to be short, this is going to be small, I just have this one specific thing that I'm
Mhm.
working on. Often that means that we're going to get the most value out of long form therapy. We're going to get the most value out of like, okay, well, this is a one small thing, but look at all this stuff has connected to it. And
Mm.
then how is that connected to that? And oh, wow. When you really zoom out, there's so many things here,
Mhm.
all sort of connected in this beautiful tree of suffering.
Mhm.
Um, but then a lot of times when a client comes in and they're like, oh, I've spent a long time processing with this is something I've been sitting with for a while and I just can't figure it out. Weirdly enough, there's usually a moment in those sessions where it's like, yeah, no, you're not a failure. Like, look at everything that you've done. You're doing pretty much what you need to do. And then that's often where it has that like epiphany moment where it
Mm.
has that like, oh, my personal growth and development isn't linear. It jumps in this moment. Um, those are really powerful too.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but that's just what I see happening.
It's
Is that what
almost a little
happens?
bit of an inverse.
Yeah. Is that what happens
Mhm.
for you?
I a version of it, I would say.
Yeah.
If somebody's well, I'm trying to think how often it really happens that clients say, well, it's this very defined thing.
Mhm.
Usually there is I would say more often than not, people come in with like two or three things.
Mm, that's
Like
fair too.
my relationship with my wife or my relationship with my husband or partner. I'm feeling stressed out and I've never gotten along with my family. Mhm. This is like, okay, if that's the case, which one do you want to focus on first?
Yeah. Let's start triaging.
Yeah, let's and start making some headway.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so I think it depends on how much stuff a person is bringing in.
Yeah.
And sometimes I would agree that if somebody says, "Oh, I'm bringing only in this little thing," it's like once you do a little bit of digging, like actually, this is a bigger thing that's connected to all of these things.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And that kinda makes me curious when you say that. How do you, like, triage that? Like, if somebody comes in with 3 different things on 3 different not necessarily levels, but, like, realms of their life, like,
Right.
one in family, one in
Yep.
work, one in personal identity.
Yep.
How do you, like, understand where to start there?
I That's kind of where it kind of go back to the client as the expert on their life. And I
You just
usually
sorta ask
ask
them?
them, like, we can go for the lowest hanging fruit that you feel like might be the easiest to tackle
Mhm.
and get some like momentum going and feel like, okay, once I have my anxiety under control, everything is going to be easier. Or we can do the opposite and go for the one that feels the most painful, that you feel like is the most urgent and needs the most attention. Um, and kind of take it from there. How do you
Okay.
do that?
Well, I think putting it in front of the client as well is a good idea too. Normally what I try and do is I just sort of keep digging until the client comes to that organically.
Mm.
Because often what we're doing there, most of what people come in with do have some kind of connection to past stuff or relational stuff or personal stuff. And so the more that I can understand, or at least get them to say out loud their understanding of
Hmm.
what's going on, the more that it will start to become evident for that client. So that they'll have that self-directive piece
Yeah.
normally happen pretty naturally or improvisationally,
Right.
hopefully. But every once in a while, I'll just be like, okay, so what do you want to do about this, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think kind of goes right back to the myth that we were talking about. We are not here to
No, yeah.
dictate and take over their lives. I was like, okay, let me in charge. I'll like figure this out for you.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, when we look at these problems that you're bringing to the table, like let's put them on the table
Mhm.
and start to make sense of it together. Like I'm consulting with you on what you think needs to happen. And your voice in that process is just as valuable, if not more valuable, than
Yeah.
my voice.
So can I ask you some questions about that as we're talking
Go
about
for
it?
it.
Because I'm really curious about this. One of the phrases that I've been using recently in my own therapy, I like to say, I have certain assumptions as a therapist that I have to believe are true. And then I'll list out like one of the assumptions that is like, uh, people are, whether they're good or not, people are inherently trying.
Mhm.
Uh, when a relationship is seeing me that whatever the problem is, its solution fundamentally is 50-50. That emotions are fundamentally illogical and will not operate with logic and stuff. Do you have any set of like core beliefs around therapy that you felt like uh, validated or built up over your experience here? Like if you lean on one or two things in a therapy room, what do you lean on?
I would say for sure I have those.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I make them very explicit
Yeah.
for better or worse, but there's definitely um, the fundamental belief around what got us on top of the food chain, um, has been our language abilities and the way that we can construct and make sense and meaning, um, and plan for the future or think about the past.
Mhm.
Like that is a very helpful thing.
Yeah.
Um, but it's also the same process that
Mhm.
can get us stuck in either worry and anxiety about the future or rumination and depression about the past.
So you really come at it from like an evolutionary biology frame or evolutionary
Uh,
psychology frame.
I would say so. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. That is true. Um, from a humanistic perspective, totally agree with you that, even the most illogical things that we do trying to help our situation, um,
Mhm.
are born out of a place of, I want to better the situation. I'm just trying to take care of it. Like, I think
Yeah.
substance use is such a big one where it's like it's so easy for society to say, well, they should just stop that,
Yeah.
not really realizing that they're using those things to take care of a different problem. And it just
Yeah.
so happens that their way that they're coping is creating a whole other set of problems.
See, and this is something that I'm glad we're touching on because I didn't even realize how like much I needed to talk about this. But that I would argue that piece specifically around substance use is one that I feel is like central and core to my therapeutic process.
Mhm.
I remember the number of the room of the office that I was in when I first realized that, oh, this person's going through a substance use thing because it's a coping skill for something else. Like
Right.
I can remember the face of the person I
Yeah.
was speaking to. That was really where I first came in because with substance use, often the spectrum of care lines up all the way from like harm reduction policies, all the way out to like moral failing policies. Like
Mhm, mhm.
you are on this drug, you are addicted in this way because you are fundamentally wrong and bad, and your job here needs to be to get better. Um, and when I first started therapy, there was some part of me that was on that side of the
Mhm,
spectrum.
mhm.
Um, and it wasn't until I actually like experienced it with a client and like saw firsthand what that shit is like that I understood that it was a much more complex
Yeah.
topic.
Context really matters.
Oh, so
And
much.
we do things for a reason. Um,
Yeah.
and I think the other thing that we fall prey to, or that maybe
Mhm.
is a trap that we have that I guess I have strong beliefs about, is that we have much less power on what's happening on the inside of our bodies when it comes to our thoughts or our feelings
Mhm.
than we do on the outside. And that we get into trouble if we try to apply the same type of like coping or solving that we do on the outside within. So for example, if we wanted to like change up the decor of this office, if we want to paint it,
Mhm.
different furniture, that's a matter of like, it's going to cost time, money, energy, but we can like change all of these things.
Yeah.
If you're sitting with anxiety
Mhm.
and you were to tell yourself, well, just don't be anxious. Like you can't just like remove the anxiety out of your system.
No,
Like
that
it
couch is
takes
bolted to the floor.
that's
Yeah.
right. And it takes a different approach to deal with that. And so I think people get into trouble that way too.
I see. Yeah.
Mhm.
That's an interesting way to look at it too. I like that idea of like, I'm not going to lie. I was a little bit nervous hearing you start that metaphor of like, oh, we can't change these things about ourselves. And I'm like, well, yeah, fundamentally, we kind of can't. Like a lot of the work that I see most effective for things like anxiety or depression are often about that acceptance of the fact that they
Mhm.
do have some control over us and commitment to what we want to do about it therapeutically, acceptance, commitment therapy. Um, uh,
And
that's,
and again, like if you have my car is due for service.
yeah,
So the maintenance lamp started blinking on the dashboard. Like that's how I think about emotions. If you
yeah,
have anxiety showing up, it's a lamp that's going off that's telling you there is something happening that needs your attention.
mm,
And I think our knee jerk reaction as humans, if we don't like something, we want it to go away. And
yeah,
so we want anxiety to go away. And so we're going to do something, maybe numb out or talk about substances or
yeah,
distract or get really busy to just like not essentially like a way to like cover up the anxiety on the dashboard. When
absolutely.
really the approach would be understanding, okay, what's that anxiety trying to tell me? And what changes would I need to make for that lamp to go off? And it will go off because, like
Yeah,
you were saying earlier, if I if I just avoid or stuff it into the corner or like put a sticky note over it, well, at some point the engine is going to break down.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
then we have a way bigger issue. Like it doesn't solve it.
And the worst part is, to unbind the metaphor a little bit, when our engines start to break down because we've been covering up the oil light,
Mhm,
it's not usually at the bastard at work who's been really making our life hell. It's
mhm,
usually at our partner.
mhm.
It's usually at like people who
Our
don't,
kids, the people
yeah,
that don't deserve it.
people who don't deserve it.
Mhm,
That's something that I think about all the time with this work.
yeah. And I think that's also where we get into a thing that you could have taken care of more easily a couple weeks ago now becomes this whole thing. Like you can either, Brene talks about this, and I love this idea.
Yeah.
Like you can either take care of your thoughts and feelings, or eventually your thoughts and feelings are going to take care of you.
Yep.
And if you don't pay attention to the anxiety, and if you just numb out or whatever the feeling is or the stress levels, um, they're going to take the wheel out of your hand and they'll be in charge of you.
Yeah, that's true.
Mhm.
And that's something that I really hope try to help my clients avoid.
Yeah.
Um, That's another thing that I think you're touching on there. That idea that like if we do bottle these things up, sometimes they come out in ways that we don't like. And what's interesting about that is when they come out in ways that we don't like, normally that causes an emotional experience, primarily shame or guilt, which, funny enough, is the kind of experience that a person doesn't want to feel. So they bottle it up.
Mhm.
So these things can develop like a cycle in that way. So a lot of the work that I find most valuable is around like coming to acceptance around those kinds of
Mhm.
things. Like, yeah, it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to fuck up. It's okay to fuck up big.
Yeah.
I know for a fact I have. Um,
Yeah, that's where our profession is so different than the medical profession, and that's also me being very naive about what happens in the
that's
operating
true.
room.
I don't
But
know.
like
I don't know anything about that either.
and I sit with a lot of physicians, so really I should be asking them these questions. But I think about like there's an issue. Okay, let's remove the gallbladder and problem solved.
Yeah.
And that's usually the type of approach that people, and I've done in the past too. Like I'm feeling stressed or anxious, I want to get rid of that.
Get this
When
anxiety out of me.
really what happens in therapies is almost the inverse. We
Yeah.
start to like zero in on, well, let's talk about that anxiety. Let's talk about how that manifests.
Mhm.
Like where do you notice that we we almost like shine a light on it, and in
Yeah.
that process help um like extinguish the light because we're taking care of the source
Yeah.
as opposed to ripping out the light because it's bothering us.
Exactly. Yeah. If a monster in the closet is always going to be 10 times scarier than the jacket that it was made of, just on
Mhm,
the floor in the clear light of day, right? Hearing you talk about that, it made me think about the way that therapy can sometimes be very uncomfortable to engage with. Like
mhm,
we were talking about different clientele. If it's your first time in therapy, that is a very, very uncomfortable
mhm,
experience. It's
mhm,
something I tell all my clients that therapy brings up emotional experiences intentionally that we as people in our current society are trained not to feel or experience. That can be very, very uncomfortable for some people. I think ultimately that's where a lot of the stigma comes from is the discomfort that a lot of people in our
mhm,
society have around this. And the fact that to do therapy is to engage with it, right? Um, And that's why I think that the way that I practice now with my more humanistic Rogerian, like relationship focused thing is so important because I know for a fact if I have to do something deeply uncomfortable and deeply like antithetical to who I was, I would want to do it with somebody that I trusted
mhm,
and at least like I felt knew me and cared about me and wasn't going to judge me if I did
mhm.
something dumb.
Yeah, to me, it's to throw in another metaphor. It's this idea of like if I've been doing a good job finding a spot in my house or an empty room and just shoving all the shit that I don't like into that room and then closing the door, like yeah, my house is gonna look really good.
Mhm.
I just can't go over here. Like I can't let you in here and like show you that part because once I open the door, like unravels.
It'll kill me. Yeah.
And I think that happens sometimes when we start in therapy. It's like, well, let's go back to that room that you like so carefully curated and crafted and like put all the blankets over this stuff.
Yeah.
I've literally done this in my house. I've put blanket over things that I didn't want to see. Um,
I
but
respect it.
that's the initial like discomfort of like, oh, now I'm looking at all that stuff.
Hmm.
But I think unlike before, it's a temporary discomfort of, okay, yeah, let's look at this, but you no longer have to face it alone. I'm here to help you,
Yeah.
and let's look at this one by one.
And it's
And
temporary versus
it's
permanent.
temporary because the other option is to just add more to it maybe get a second room, get a storage unit. Like
Mhm.
you're just adding to the problem. It's not really actually solving.
Exactly.
So,
And I think it is important to speak on that, like, temporary versus permanent
yeah.
suffering. Like, there are some things that people run into that will always carry with us, like certain losses, certain griefs, certain mistakes we've made in the past, often form this sort of like defining layer of our own understanding. But for the most part, most of what I deal with in my therapy work is fundamentally temporary.
Mhm,
Like, even if it's been with somebody for a while, like, even if it's been with somebody for so long, like, a lot of times just helping somebody through that anxiety,
mhm,
getting them to really open that door and pull up the blanket and see what has
mhm.
actually been under that the whole time.
And I would
Yeah,
even say, I would argue, even with grief or things that are permanent or losses or really hard things that have happened,
yeah,
I think you can change the relationship of going from this grief being in charge of you and kind of dictating and ruling your identity
yeah.
to finding a place of like, yes, this has happened. When I think about it, it's very sad. I still miss this person to this day,
Mhm.
but it's not the defining factor of my life.
Yeah, and I actually, I have a theory about this. I haven't read this anywhere, but I'm curious what you think about this. My understanding about trauma is that it is fundamentally transformative. It is in some way a change that cannot be come back from, right?
Mhm,
Um, and I'm curious if there's something to the grief process about finding a way for that change to fit into your regular life.
mhm,
Like, maybe that's the that's my understanding of the distinction you're talking
mhm,
about, is when a person goes from where they are consumed by their grief
mhm,
to which they can hold the grief in their hands,
mhm.
that change is that they've come to accept whatever change the trauma has brought upon them. No, I accept that I don't have this person in my life anymore. I accept that that was a door that was open and is now closed. Um, so yeah, that can be really tough.
Maybe
But
it's
what do you
because
think?
I'm like looking at Vanderbilt Hospital and like I'm having all these medical analogies. Like I'm thinking about my own body. Like
Yeah,
in my teenage years, I got my appendix taken out.
I know
And
that.
I have, yeah, I know.
Yeah,
I usually don't lead with it. It's,
right.
and I think that's really that. Like, had you met me when that happened, you
It would
probably would
be,
have heard about it.
yeah.
The week before the surgery, after, of course, it was very present.
Mhm.
Um, I still have that scar. Like, I don't have the appendix, and I can think about it. I can look at it, but it's that experience is not defining me. Like it's a part of me and it will always be a part of me. So obviously an appendix
Yeah,
is a little bit different than it's very different than losing a person that you cared about. Um,
yeah.
but it's kind of that there's like an acuity to it.
Mhm,
The loss is going to forever change you,
mhm.
but that doesn't mean that the loss is going to be the defining thing
Yeah,
that sets you up negative trajectory for the rest of your life.
it's one of the most beautiful parts about this work
Yeah.
is that, uh, weirdly enough, our greatest strengths are often our greatest weaknesses, but also our greatest pains are often the thing that we can use to develop our greatest strengths. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
I really enjoy the process of this
Yeah.
work.
I think I want us to talk a little bit to people that are watching this
Mhm.
and are
The lovely fans, yes.
interested in giving therapy a shot,
Mhm.
like reaching out for consultation. Because I think you were speaking to it earlier. This can be a really daunting, scary process in
Oh,
terms
yeah.
of this is something brand new I've never tried before. There's a shit ton of stigma around it. I have certain ideas as to how this is going to go. I have no idea how it really goes. And what if this really just makes it worse?
Yeah.
Um, so when you think about people that are interested in reaching out, what would you tell them?
What would I tell him? Please reach out. Uh, somebody who's feeling anxious about that process, but would otherwise sort of go through with it. What I would recommend, what I would tell them is, I think you're doing the right thing. I think it's hard to do that, but I'm proud of you for doing it if that's the case. Uh, Ultimately, though, if you're a person who feels sort of like you're on the fence and you don't know if you want to do therapy, or if you do want to do therapy, or wherever you sit with that, um, I would say that mental health therapy has a tremendous amount of stigma around it for a lot of reasons. But ultimately, I would look at it more like physical therapy than mental health therapy. Ultimately, what we're doing is we're working with the mind and the emotions instead of the physicality, but we're working on the same things. We're working on flexibility, we're working on strength, and we're working on stability while holding a certain position. That's all we're doing emotionally. it can be very intimidating and scary. But the idea here is that it's hopefully personalized enough and relational enough that if a person's going too fast or a therapist is going too fast, that you can talk to them about it, give them feedback on that. I don't think I've met a therapist out there who would not appreciate and deeply respect uh, having someone call them an asshole if they're being an asshole. That is like fun. Like that is our job, is to be here for the client. So if there is a person out there who is feeling sort of on the fence, I would really recommend reaching out anyways. The consultations obviously are free. And if you don't like it, you obviously don't have to join. But yeah, there's no way to know until you try. So I'd be really delighted to sit down with anybody who would be interested in meeting with me. So
Yeah. Yeah, that's well said. I think I super agree with you. It's a brave and courageous step
it
trying
is.
something for the first time, anything. Like if
Yeah.
it's going to a new part of town by yourself or trying out a new sport, um, it's a brave thing to do. And
Yeah.
so, um, yeah, I think you can be proud of yourself for just like trying it out. The other piece is you don't have to jump into the deep end of the pool head first. Like you can start at the shallow end. You can do a 15-minute consultation and like
Yeah.
slowly walk in. And even during the first conversation, if there's things that you feel like, oh, like at some point I want to share this, but I literally just met you. This has been 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Um, you don't have to share everything right away. Like you can
No.
hold that back and you can like go at your pace and we can take it at your pace. And I love the analogy of, just like
Yeah.
you would hire a personal trainer to help you achieve more flexibility, strength of your
Mhm.
physical body. I see myself in that same vein as a consultant, as a coach, as somebody.
There's that business language. Yeah.
There you go. That's right. Yeah. That's
Meeting people where they're at.
that's right. Um yeah, being the consultant of helping you with your brain because Brene has this beautiful saying. She talks about, flying a bunch of stuff or a bunch of times, flying all over for trainings, whatever else. And she said, just because I'm a frequent flyer and I fly all the time doesn't mean you can dub me pilot and put me in the pilot seat and steer the plane.
Yeah.
Like there's a very distinct set. And just because we think and feel all the time from the moment we are born doesn't mean that we know how to make sense of and work with our emotions and our thoughts. And to find somebody that's going to help you train that part of you
Hmm.
to be a better steward, a better pilot uh,
Meat suit.
of your body, that is like how is it a flaw? Like that makes
Yeah.
sense. It doesn't make sense to not do that.
I think that would, yeah, that would line up with how I view the world as well. And ultimately, where all of this lands is that ultimately this process is meant to simulate a process that happens very naturally.
Mhm,
The idea of connecting with somebody and engaging with somebody and genuinely being cared for by that person.
mhm,
Um, and a lot of times it's the case that people have this cruft built up where they don't feel like they can get that anywhere else.
mhm.
And that's exactly what therapy is here for. We're here to help. We're not here to necessarily replace that connection. We're here to help people figure out what internal muscles they're not using
Yeah,
correctly to do that for themselves, you
yeah.
know? Um,
And I hope people watching this saw like just like we're being very transparent and open about here's how we feel about it. Like here's how this works. Like I understand when somebody comes to therapy for the first time, they'll have some thoughts as to how therapy works, whether or not that is true. That might be just, what family is saying or what they picked up at movies.
right.
And I am very open. And obviously, I'm a nerd. So I'm like, love the types of conversations where we talk about, okay, why are we talking about this right now?
Hmm.
Why are you having me do this? How exactly is this working? Like, what are we trying to accomplish here? Like, having just a conversation about what it is that we're doing, I'm always happy to
Yeah.
like explain what's happening and why. If
I,
people ever feel like they're in the dark and just kind of showing up.
I am constantly trying to explain what's going
Yeah.
on. The number of times where I will like literally do the math out loud as okay, well, but that wouldn't make sense because, okay, so there, I understand now.
Yeah.
That's one of the more powerful things. I like to make the sausage in front of the
Yeah.
people that I
That's
then
right.
serve sausage
Right.
to. Um, yeah, but thank you very much for this
Yeah.
conversation here.
This has been great. Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you feel like would be worth
Um,
chatting about or mentioning?
uh, Try therapy. It's very fun. ultimately this process is meant to be personalized. It's meant to be your own journey that you're getting people to help sort of walk you through to Sherpa in some way. Take it at your own pace, engage with it at your own time. Uh, if you feel that therapy would be really good for you, or if you're on the fence, I cannot recommend enough trying it out.
Mhm.
Not just with me, but with anybody here on staff. So, uh, yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Joe.
Yeah, absolutely.